Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another meeting of our online book club, reading through G.K. Chesterton's The Everlasting Man in the wonderful Word on Fire edition, edited and with commentary by Dale Alquist. My name is Joe Grabowski, and I am the VP for Evangelization and Mission here at the Society of G.K. Chesterton. I'm subbing in tonight for Susan Sucher. I ask everyone if you could to keep Susan in in your prayers, along with her son who suffered a motorcycle accident and needs to have some surgery to repair the injuries to his leg that were sustained there. So Susan is spending time with him, and I know that we can count on all of you to lift up Susan and her family in your prayers this evening. I'm thrilled to be joined this evening by Rita Bartell Drum and Susan Gove, who are members of the Whidbey Island Chesterton Society, and I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves. Ladies, welcome.
Thank you.
Hi. Rita Bartell Drum. Let's see. Wife, mom, pathology assistant by profession, Hillsdale College associate, instructor of classical literature, and that's my life.
And I'm Susan Gove, wife, mother, a great believer in lifetime intellectual pursuits. I have many hobbies, but the one closest to my heart is my two Jack Russell Terriers, who I show and spend many happy hours with.
Beautiful. Well, welcome, and thank you both for being here, and welcome to all of you in the chat. I see many of our regular participants tuning in. We have people tuning in all the way from Brazil. We also have people from various other states. If you're first time in the chat, please do let us know. We're thrilled to have you. And of course, you can catch up on all the meetings that you missed in the playlist. So make sure you're subscribed and you'll get the link to that. As usual, we have an icebreaker question here. This week, we're going to ask both you, our guests, Rita and Susan, but also those of you in the chat to chime in with your answers as well. Whether you have any hobby interests other than G.K. Chesterton, obviously, because that would be the easiest and obvious answer. So, how about you, ladies? Any hobbies, or you did mention the Jack Russell Terriers, but maybe an additional one to that?
Gardening.
Okay.
Every year, it's new, it's different, but it's always bountiful.
Beautiful, beautiful. How about you, Rita?
My big fancy in life is having large gala parties at my home, collecting dishes, serving plates, all sorts of things. And because I collect them so diligently, my husband expects me to have huge gala parties to use all those. Otherwise, he said, Rita, get those out of the house.
Lovely, lovely. Yeah, I'm also quite a fan of entertaining in the home. I like to have parties and have guests over, whether it's in the house or on my back deck or in the backyard around a fire pit, especially at this time of year. That's charming. And for any of those in the chat or among our viewers know me on Instagram or follow me on any social media, you'll also know that I have a great passion for cooking, for testing myself against recipes that are out there, but also inventing things myself, improvising based on what I have in the pantry. We do have a few good responses coming in from our folks tuning in. Teresa says harp playing and knitting, which is really knitting, maybe I think more common, but harp playing sounds a bit unique, so that's wonderful. Another gardener from Joan Perillo here, helping gardening, she says, helps to appreciate God's creation. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that Chesterton's wife was an avid gardener herself, and Frances Chesterton had quite a noteworthy little garden. And one of the great anecdotes about Chesterton's wife is that she planted her wedding bouquet in the garden and managed to sustain it as a plant after it was a live flower wedding bouquet, and she managed to get get it to reroot and grow. And cuttings of that have been made. And so, there are people throughout the world who have a little bit of Chesterton's wedding bouquet in their own gardens throughout the world. So, leatherworking, another answer here. Collecting Christian vinyl records, which is another unique one. Genealogy. Uh, Jeff Miller, one of our regulars. Guitar, cycling, a bookaholic. Uh, let's see, who else can we go to? PG Woodhouse, hike, smoking, and gardening. That's a good trio, I think, to end on. Well, thank you all for participating, and we'll be referring to chat throughout the evening and trying to get your participation in our discussion as we move on now to talk about this wonderful chapter in the book, "The Escape from Paganism in the Everlasting Man." And I think as Dale says in his commentary, uh, you know, this is sort of fine. We're getting close to Chesterton wrapping up the interaction with the field of so-called comparative religion that he set out at the beginning of this book to say that he was going to be kind of refuting the common way of approaching comparative religion. And even though he says in a way he's not going to be talking about other religions, he has spent quite a lot of time talking about them. But this is sort of the final one. He's speaking about paganism in this chapter, but he starts, as Chesterton is wont to do, he starts kind of in a unique place with the position of the missionary, the Christian missionary, and he says, he asks this provocative question: why might a missionary not agree with the proposition that all religions are equal? And the answer to that comes on page 396 in the book, which is the very first page of the chapter, where he says it's rather ridiculous to ask a man just about to be boiled in a pot and eaten at a purely religious feast why he does not regard all religions as equally friendly and fraternal. So, how do we react to this idea of the Christian missionary not thinking religions are equal? What do we think is maybe the point of Chesterton beginning this conversation here? What do you ladies think about it?
Well, I'm addressing the question that we have here. Why
Mm-hmm.
might a missionary not agree with the proposition that all religions are equal? And it's because a missionary during the time of Chesterton, in the present day, or whenever, brings with him a precious creed that is not like any other religion. The creed is God's inerrant word. It's historically accurate. It's a sustenance for people through the millennia. And finally, it's the key that opens the lock, which is life. And in addition to that, in regard to the missionary not agreeing that all religions are equal, there's a phrase: we put our money where our mouth is, as it were. And so missionaries put their time where their value system is, and they put their life on the line. Yes, Chesterton's missionary could be hyperbole or whatever. However, your regular missionary will be in the mission field for perhaps 30 years, and they will actually give their life, the time that they would spend marrying, building a family, and so forth. So it kind of substantiates the fact that definitely no missionary would think that all religions are equal.
Mm-hmm. Susan, would you like to add anything?
This is a bit indirect, but most of us have heard the quote from Mother Teresa, who said, I love all religions, but I love my own the most. And she's been vilified and praised for those words. So that came to mind when I was reading this and listening to what Rita mentioned in her comments.
Sure. Well, I think this flows nicely into the next question, which is from the back of the book, which is, if the modern missionary claims he is exceptional in being Christian, is he right? And then, kind of a follow up to that is, in what way could the missionary say things in the wrong spirit and be spiritually wrong? I'll read that passage from the book that I think Dale is kind of indicating us towards there. He says, um, if the missionary says, in fact, that he is exceptional in being a Christian, and that the rest of the races and religions can be classified collectively as heathen, he is perfectly right. He may say it in quite the wrong spirit, in which case he is spiritually wrong, but in the cold light of philosophy and history, he is intellectually right. He may not be right minded, but he is right. He may not even have a right to be right, but he is right. So, very typically pithy of Chesterton there, and I do think that this relates. Rob Grieving in the chat, one of our folks, brings up a very kind of obvious point, that we might miss. He says, if the missionary believed that all religions were equal, he wouldn't be a missionary, right? And so this kind of relates us back to this question that we're considering right now, that you know the Christian missionary obviously is going to view his particular message as exceptional, because otherwise he wouldn't be out there risking his life to preach it to the ends of the earth. Uh, I wonder what other reactions you might have to this.
Well, yes, the modern missionary is certainly exceptional. And one of the things that the modern missionary did is to answer the question that Pontius Pilate asked Jesus in John chapter 18. And that was, what is truth? And that's a question that we also must answer. I also like where Chesterton, somewhat later in the book or in the chapter, states what the fate is like for those who fail to decide. It's just a 2-sentence statement, but it touched me very much. It's that there's the masonry, and he's carving something out of stone, but yet he's very reticent to carve that. And so the would-be statue is now somewhat of a slave. And I found that a very interesting mental picture for me. And I thought quite a bit about it. And I've given it thought for a number of days now. And seeing people who are sometimes slaves to certain things because they will not move away from them. It brought me also to remembering a group of statues that Michelangelo was commissioned to make, and they're called the Slaves. And what they are is they're a group of statues. The figures are absolutely beautiful. The people are wonderfully formed. However, they're still in marble, maybe from their torso down, or maybe their leg will still be in marble. So they are exemplary of slaves. So it's a very interesting thought pattern that came to me. And so I would say that those people, the people who are slaves, are representative of those who do not actually make a decision one way or another. And yes, the missionary is exceptional for making a decision.
Very well put. Yeah. And what this particular kind of question prompt brought to mind for me, I think it's in this book where, way back in the beginning, Chesterton is sort of setting up this kind of framework of the way he wants to approach the question. And he talks about sort of the pretense of wanting a nonpartisan take on something, and that's somehow more objective. And he kind of calls this out for, I think, the fallacy that it is, right? It would be, as I was thinking about this question, reading in preparation for this evening, I thought of, this is like, it's akin to saying that the only person, the person who says all women are the same, right, is obviously the man who's not married, who doesn't have a wife, right? If you ask the married man, is your wife different? Is your wife special? Is your wife unique? he's going to give a very different answer. It's only the abstract kind of, it's only the atheist, it's only the non-believer, as you put it, Rita, the person who has not made a decision, who can uh, attain and preserve that false aloofness from the question. And it's only in that sense the man of no religion who believes that all religions are equal. Any person who's at all genuinely committed to a religion will at some point probably be driven to the conclusion that there are differences and differences with distinction among the religions. So, Susan, would you like to add anything?
Just a short comment. Chesterton did, in this regard, say that the missionary must be spiritually right.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is a distinction to pay close attention to.
It is indeed, yeah. And I mean, it's, famously attributed to, I think, Kubla Khan, who said, I would be powerfully motivated to become a Christian if I ever met one. And Gandhi says something similar, that it's not Christianity he has a problem with, it's Christians. And so I think that Chesterton is pointing out that you can be perfectly right in the statement, in the objective content of the statement, that Christianity is exceptional, but it's it's part of that high calling and why we need God's grace, especially those who are called to any kind of missionary witness, because it is the scandal presented when Christians don't live up to the own message that they're preaching, when they become Pharisaical. I think that that's sort of what he's making a scant reference to here, that obviously missionaries can be wrong in the manner of preaching the gospel because they're maybe not living the gospel, but none of that affects the objective content of the truth in the message itself. All right, let's see what the chat has to say. There, Kenneth Stack says we're not superior, but sinners forgiven. But we do have a life-changing message. That's kind of what we ended up discussing there. Amen, Kenneth. Well put. That when we go forth, there's something in St. Paul to that effect, right? That he's first in mercy because he was chief of sinners, right? And that he is first the beneficiary of this forgiveness, and that's largely what I think motivates the missionary in ancient times and in modern. So, okay, well, now we're moving on to heathenry and paganism properly considered, which is the bulk of this chapter. And Chesterton asks, what does humanity share with heathenry? And he goes on quite a long way in answering this question, but I wonder if either of you came up with any particularly compelling answers to, or what Dale was trying to get us to pull out of the chapter with this question prompt.
Well, I'm going to initially quote Dale Alquist, the natural man in search of the supernatural. And that is true, that is what all humanity and heathenry do share, because prior to our walking with our Lord, we too were the natural man searching for the supernatural. As well, all humanity, pre-Christian, and those who are not yet Christian, are represented by St. Augustine's statement that our hearts are restless until they rest in thee, O Lord. So we do share that. And then I would say that all mankind, humanity, heathen, etc., do have faith and they do have charity. However, they do not have the blessed hope that we have as Christians.
Well said. Susan?
I certainly like what Rita just said. A particular part of this passage that I was attracted to was the metaphor of the boat before the sea. And the idea that the sea before the boat.
Mm-hmm.
Um, to me, that was that which existed before Christianity, or the sea. And then when Christianity um, came to the world, that was the boat. And I like this because there are so many of Jesus' miracles near the sea, on the water, in the boat. So I felt like this particular metaphor really illuminated that whole section. It gave you a visual.
Mm-hmm. Certainly, yeah. So that's and for those following along, he's that quote comes at the bottom of 397, continuing on to 398. That just as these common elements in humanity exist and are common in the way that the sea precedes the boat, and all of mankind. I think Chesterton's point is all of mankind has always yearned after and tried to seek the supernatural, as Rita pointed out. Chesterton observes somewhere else that though when you get rid of the supernatural, when you exclude the supernatural, you're not left with the natural, you're left with the unnatural, right? It's one of those typical quippy, paradoxical ways of putting it that Chesterton has. But I think that that's the crisis sort of that he wants to drive us towards here. And so I think we'll move right into so in his sketch, he's saying that all humanity sort of had this drive towards the supernatural. The two basic approaches to it were the philosophers, and he's this framework that he's laid out throughout the book: God, the gods, the demons, and the philosophers. So you have the philosophical approach, and then you have God and the gods and the demons, which are the approaches of religion and of the various paganisms. So he asks where ancient paganism remains, and he answers it very simply. He says Asia stands as the one representative of paganism and one rival to Christendom that remains in the world today. And he goes on at great length talking about sort of this contrast between Asia and Europe. And he goes on to say that the religion of Asia, the religion of Europe today would look very much like the religions of Asia were it not for Christianity. So I wonder if we could just spend some time talking about this very lengthy part, the kind of the meat of this chapter, where he sort of makes this claim, and it's something that comes up again and again in Chesterton, the East, the Asiatic religions, and he's obviously very fascinated with it. What do we think he's driving at here?
Well, initially, I'm going to share a quote from Chesterton that kind of explains that to a degree. Without Christianity, men entangled in the forest of their own mythology, drowned in their own metaphysics. And so that seems to be a partial answer. I was also thinking about, he spoke about it was a Persian carpet and a tessellated Roman pavement, and how they were substantial until they were kept by the wonder of Christianity. So that's kind of how I answered that question. It was a bit difficult for me. So, Susan?
Yeah. This section really, I feel, presents a purposeful challenge by Chesterton. He's not throwing down the gauntlet, but he's drawing the line in the sand. And I too was very taken by the last part of that comment where Chesterton talked about the crack in the pavement from the earthquake of the crucifixion.
Mm-hmm.
How powerful is that?
Yeah. Yeah, it's quite a compelling, and it's one of those passages in this book where Chesterton goes on his flight of rhetorical,
Yes.
wordsmithing, which he's so adept at doing. I love, and I think it's worth always just reading a little bit where he says, this quote about Europe looking very much like Asia were it not for Christianity. um, he says, "Asia is all humanity as it has worked out its human doom. Asia, in its vast territory and its varied populations and its heights of past achievement and its depths of dark speculation, is itself a world and represents something of what we mean when we speak of the world. It is a cosmos rather than a continent. It is the world as man has made it and contains many of the most wonderful things that man has made. Therefore, Asia stands as the one representative of paganism and the one rival to Christendom." And again, he goes on in this kind of very high prose, and I think his point is that now in the modern age, really, it is the only comparable thing. You might have paganisms that exist in uncontacted tribes, and at Chesterton's time, certainly there was talk of like cannibals in island communities apart and so forth, but that's not the paganism that Christianity enters the world and encounters. What Christianity at that crisis moment, it enters and it encounters a high civilization with advanced philosophy and paganism. And so he's this whole purpose of imaginatively entering into the story, right? Imagining what would have been like to encounter Christ. He's sort of, I think, pushing us into that consideration and saying the only way you can imagine how Christianity confronts paganism is to imagine this sort of difference between the Asia that we know now and the Europe formed in the faith that we know now. I wonder if you have any additional thoughts kind of in that vein. No? Or maybe from the chat? I do see we have some chat things coming in. Let's see. So Jeff Miller is quoting here. He's great at quoting Chesterton. It's not prejudice, but practical experience, which says that Asia is a hill of demons as well as gods, or I think maybe full of demons as well as gods. Is there might be a typo there. Sheila Tobin comments that she likes the way that Chesterton compared the gods of Rome and Greece to Hindu gods of today. So many people drawn to Eastern religions, but when the comparison is made, it really makes you think. Yeah, I agree. And, again, with Chesterton sort of driving to a point, I think what we could say is the point that he's sort of pushing towards in this part of the conversation is that we really only have, back to the basics, those four options: God, the gods, the demons, and the philosophers. I do love, and it's not one of Dale's questions in the book per se, but I do love the case that Chesterton makes, and I think rightly so, that when all you're left with is the pagans and the philosophers, the pagans are going to win, right? He says that, pagan Greece puts Socrates to death for atheism, for impiety, right? And that does seem to be the way that the story goes. So I think he makes a compelling case that if Europe had not been affected, if the West had not been affected by Christianity, it would maybe look like the Asia of today. Yeah. Any further thoughts before we move on to our next question?
Yes, I was noticing in the feed here, the chat. Could you speak to WW's comment there? Do you
Yeah,
see it?
sure. Yeah, pull
Yeah.
it up here. If you find yourself in a conversation and the question is asked of you, what is the difference between Christianity and paganism? How would you answer that question given a 3-minute conversation? I like it. So as the host, I get the privilege of saying, "What do you think?" You asked me to put it up, but I'm gonna kick it back to you for the answer. What do you think?
I would say I would start with the story and the journey that Chesterton brings up in several places. He talks about a short story, always has a beginning and an end. But he goes on to say that with the other deities, multiple deity religions, if you will, there's never really a journey or a story.
Hmm.
So that would be my um, answer to this great question.
It is a great question. Yeah, Rita, do you have any thoughts?
Yes, I would agree about the journey and the story. But we also need to somehow pepper our conversation with our own story. Many times, people will see our lives in the current and they'll say, gee, this is just wonderful. You're so blessed. But if we also share from what we came from before we were His, it's very compelling as well.
Yeah. I think I would give to this sort of the Chestertonian answer too. That one major difference that I could give in a 3-minute conversation is that it is only Christianity. His point is that it's only Christianity that creates that militant going forth to convert and to bring people over. He discounts obviously Islam as what he says is a Christian heresy. Maybe we could talk to that later on, but he he makes that point. The church militant is unique because it is an army marching to effect a universal deliverance, whereas it was and I think is very often the tendency of paganism to accommodate and to simply add to the pantheon of gods. When the Romans went out and they conquered or overcame certain pagan tribes, they were perfectly happy to bring, let's say, Thor or Woden in alongside the gods that they had in their own temples. So uh, I think that that's one of the major differences, is that Christianity goes on the march to convert. It's never, you know content to kind of just be a private affair. So great question though. Thank you for adding. We have a lot more activity in the chat here. Gosh, some other answers. Rob Grieving answers the question: we believe God became man and died for us, which is and died for us. I think is the key there, Rob. Right? Because you might have ideas of the God taking on human flesh that come up in some of the pagan myths, but it's not the same story. It's not the same point as what the Christian claim is. Uh, Jeff Miller points out we may call Buddhism a faith, though to us it seems more like a doubt, and that's true. It's maybe based on more holia via negativa. Um, Francis Brinker says paganism offers philosophy/reason versus storytelling myth. Christianity combines philosophy and storytelling to illustrate the truth. So, and then finally, Joan Perillo. Paganism relies on the natural world for inspiration, but Christianity draws us to the supernatural as giving meaning to our existence. I think that's true. Uh, well, thank you all for your answers in the chat. I do want to move on to our next kind of question from the end of the book, so that we make sure to try to get through as much of this as we can. We might have to skip a few as we go on here, but we'll see. The next one is, what is the most liberal part of theology and why? And we do have kind of pointed remark that he makes to this effect on page 410, where he says there will be no end to the weary debates about liberalizing theology until people face the fact that the only liberal part of it is really the dogmatic part. This might strike some as maybe a paradox too far, or a little too clever by half, but what what do we think about what Chesterton is pointing out here?
Well, the dogmatic part allows us to have free will, and it's not just rogue free will, but it's free will under his provident hand. And the only other alternative is self will. And self will may sound very attractive at first blush. However, the reality is that we don't really have self will ever unless we're under his free will. And I can substantiate that with the word of God. We do not fight against flesh and blood, but powers and principalities. So this earth causes us to choose either to be under his providential hand or to realize that we are not flesh and blood. We are being moved and manipulated by powers and principalities. It's kind of interesting. I'm going to quote Bob Dylan. There's a song that he states, we all have to serve someone. And we have to be careful who we serve. We either serve our king or we serve the powers and principalities of this earth. I don't feel embarrassed to quote Bob Dylan because I've noticed that of recent years, Bishop Barron has had a penchant of quoting Bob Dylan as well.
Absolutely.
The other, yeah, definitely, he does that, and it's quite interesting. The other thing is, I think about Mr. Smith and Golders Green, and someone had asked the question, well, gee, what will happen with Mr. Smith? Will he become a better person, a worse person, or remain the same? And the answer was, it depends on what he chooses to do. And I felt that was a very kind of simple A leads to B kind of statement. And I think it's kind of attractive because sometimes people who are not walking with our Lord yet will need something of that nature. And it's kind of exemplary of Occam's razor. The simplest answer is the best answer.
Great. Susan, do you have any thoughts on the liberal part of theology?
Yeah, I'm looking at the feed, the chat here, and Rob Breathing, I hope I'm saying that correctly. You are on tonight. The dogmas force you to make a choice, and choices are how we show we are free. Beautifully said.
Very well said. Yes. Yeah, and I think that's an important thing too. When Chesterton is using the word liberal, right? It's going to mean something. He's sort of speaking about a philosophical definition of liberal or a classical liberal idea of freedom. Not He doesn't mean liberal theology necessarily the way it's come to mean progressive or Now he does talk about liberalizing trends in theology in his day, which were the ones trying to say, there's too many dogmas, we need to get away from dogmas. And he battles this really throughout his whole career, talking about, he uses examples akin to art sometimes, right? It's the rules that allow you to accomplish something. If you don't have the frame is what makes the picture, right? So he has a lot of metaphors for why the dogmas aren't limiting; they are actually liberating. They free us to be able to escape from that narrow circle of what paganism and philosophy sometimes trap us into, because they give us an actual road out of the merely natural into the truly supernatural. So, any other thoughts? All right. So the next question from the back of the book What distinction does does Chesterton make between the God of science and the God of miracles? What do we say to this one?
Well, the God of science is immutable, unemotional, and truly not changing. It could be similar to robotics or artificial intelligence. I recall as a young woman one of my encounters with the God of science. Myself and my classmates were asked to prepare an essay, and then the professor was going to use a program called Turnitin to recognize whether or not there's any sort of plagiarism. And we all spoke to the professor, oh, please, please don't do that. Because it just seems that one syntax and another person's syntax could be very, very similar. So it seemed like a very fear-provoking type of thing. But the answer was, no, that's the way it is. So that's kind of the God of science. Now, the God of miracles is very different. He walks beside us. He listens to our prayers for the living and for the dead. He changes natural law if that's necessary. And Chesterton says that those who are walking with the God of miracles are living in a constitutional commonwealth. And a constitutional commonwealth is a group of people who are self-governing under a predetermined constitution. So it's a far more beneficent type of God to walk under. Finally, Chesterton had written a poem that discusses the God of miracles. Lepanto, the story, it's a true, actual, historic event. 1517, the Ottoman Empire was attempting to overtake Lepanto in Greece, and the people in Greece were outnumbered 3-1, and they prayed their rosary, and God allowed them to be victorious. So that is truly the God of miracles, and it's an actual historic event. And that's why we have October 7th as the national or probably international day of the rosary.
That's right. Yeah, and that just one, you might have read it around there. It's 1571 was the year, and I only point that out. The importance between 1517 and 71 is that one of the things that required a miracle, let's say at Lepanto, was that Europe had been broken apart internally, right? Because in between those two time periods, the Reformation had set in, and so now you had less of an ability than had been for the Christian West to come together and confront the Turkish threat. So sadly, like Elizabeth in England would not send any support to the Holy League to participate in defending, Eastern Europe there. So we have another comment in the chat related to this that Lisa Wheeler says, you're reading Lepanto in your GKC Society this month. Lisa, let us know which society that is. Maybe there's others participating in the chat that would like to join you for that conversation. I could recommend to all those out there that are involved in local societies, September or October are great months to read and consider this great poem, very timely at this time of year. So back to our question, because Susan, I wanted to make sure that you had the opportunity to respond. The distinction between the God of science and the God of miracles. Did you have anything you'd want to add there?
No, I think what you've said and what Rita mentioned, and then the chat also covers it beautifully.
Yeah, as Jeff Miller was quoting here again from the chapter, it's precisely the God of miracles and of answered prayers who reminds us of a liberal and popular prince receiving petitions, listening to parliaments, considering the cases of the whole people. Yeah. And, the God of science, it's an interesting turn of phrase that Chesterton uses there. Because in a certain sense, there is no God of science. Science is the God, right? For those that enter into that scientistic mentality. and it is again just another closed system. And so what he's doing here, I think, is he's continually reminding us that, you know, as he says elsewhere in the book, mankind had done all that it could for itself. Uh, the various forms of paganisms, even the ones that don't descend into demon worship, the ones that are mere mythologies, the ones that are maybe uh, frivolously held, and then the philosophy, the philosophers, the work of the philosophers, all of this had reached this kind of moment of limitation. And so he speaks about that crack in the sidewalk of the crucifixion and the resurrection, right? That this breaking point is arrived at, that God has to come into the world in order to raise the world out of itself and provide that road to the truly transcendent. So
I'm just returning for a moment to the God of science. I kind of say it facetiously when I call him the God of science, or call it the God of science. I love to write it in lowercase g instead of uppercase.
Mhm.
And my husband and I kind of like to say, my husband's a physician, and I'm also trained in medical matters. And so we kind of so enjoy saying, oh, yes, the God of science, because it is certainly not a true God, although it is that way for some people.
Indeed, yeah, it functions like a god, and I think increasingly we see this tendency towards Bob Dylan being right. Right, yeah, it may be the devil or it may be the Lord, but you're going to have to serve somebody. You need ideologies and identity politics and so many other things in the modern age are becoming as religions for people in the void left by maybe less embrace of Christianity in the public square. So we do need people to live their faith proudly and show that this is also a tenable way to get out of the narrowness of one's own self, right? Uh, I think I'll skip to the final question for the chapter, which is the Catholic faith, he says, is the reconciliation of what? And this quote comes, it's pretty early on, to be fair. The answer that the Catholic faith is it's on page 390. The Catholic faith is the reconciliation. Um, let's see, because it is the realization both of mythology and philosophy. It is a story, and in that sense, one of 100 stories, only it is a true story. It is a philosophy, and in that sense, one of 100 philosophies, only it is a philosophy that is like life. Above all, it is a reconciliation because it is something that can only be called the philosophy of stories. Now, we've touched upon this in the past, and I think that the reason maybe this is sort of the ultimate way of treating this chapter is the importance of this particular idea that the story that is a true story, those familiar with the famous account of Addison's Walk, of J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis going on that famous walk in Oxford and having a conversation about Christianity, and the case being made to C.S. Lewis that Christianity is the true myth, the myth that becomes fact. Here's a very interesting precursor to that idea, right? That Christianity is a myth, it is a story, but it's the true story. It's the true story that humanity had sought all this while. So, any thoughts on this kind of final question of the chapter?
Well, my only possible answer is taking a quote from Chesterton. It's similar to what you had stated: a story that is true and a philosophy that models what life is, thereby uniting two previously ununited tendencies: the quest for a story and philosophy's search for truth. And those are Chesterton's words, and no better definition seems to come to mind at all.
And I would add to that, as ending this essay, the ending was powerful with the very simple analogy of the lock and the key.
Mhm.
I just, I, I think that sums up so beautifully um, all the previous um, thoughts, information, uh, conclusions, philosophies, rationales that Chesterton deals with um, in this essay.
Great.
Lock and
Yeah,
the
that lock and key metaphor, I know it's been spoken about on previous episodes here, meetings, and it's something that you'll find as you get into Chesterton. You'll find it popping up various places throughout his writing, right down to the end with the man with the golden key being this figure in childhood from his father's toy theater that kind of stuck with him. So it's one of those, if you will, primordial images for Chesterton, the key. It seems to stick with him from early childhood all the way through life, and it does form part of his religious imagination. So well observed. I'll end with a. I'll end my observations here with a quick quote from the commentary. This is what you get if you get this particular edition, which we pushed since the very beginning, because it's Chesterton. It's Dale on Chesterton, right? It's it's great. You have sources brought in from other of Chesterton's writing, and he speaks about this notion of the story. He says the fight is with evil. Chesterton gives us a concise explanation of evil, that strange story of treason in heaven and the great desertion by which evil damaged and tried to destroy a cosmos that it could not create. He says we have, and this is Dale now, we have the antagonist, we also have the protagonist. Christ is the hero in the great adventure story of mankind. Christianity, says Chesterton, met the mythological search for romance by being a story, and the philosophical search for truth by being a true story. And again, those quotations that Dale's pulling in there are quotations from books other than The Everlasting Man. So it shows the continuity and consistency of Chesterton's thought, but also why having a good annotated edition helps. So I do want to interact with the chat here, just kind of as we move towards wrapping up. I want to thank everybody for your participation throughout in the chat. Darren Grove had asked, where does Chesterton come up with his critique of the East? He says he goes completely on trust when Chesterton talks about the East. He's poorly educated in this way. I know my thoughts. Chesterton, the British Empire was in the East, right? It was interacting in Hong Kong and in India, uh, and really throughout the entire Levant. So there was a lot of interaction between kind of the East, and if you think of his novel, The Flying In, and the itinerant Muslim preacher, Misisa Amran, who comes over from somewhere in the Middle East. He's from one of the Arab countries, and he's preaching teetotalism in England. That's part of the setup for The Flying In as a novel. That was not an unknown phenomenon. So you had a lot of migrants into the UK, into England, into London in particular, from the territories of the British Empire. So you would have he would have had direct interaction in many cases with people, at least, who were representatives of these cultures and their religions. Anything you ladies see in the chat that you'd want to particularly interact with or respond to? It's been going by there. People are being really quick. They've brought up so many great insights. It's quite a great pleasure. Let's see. So some recommendations for books on Catholicism or Christianity and Buddhism. Anthony E. Clark, a readable book, Catholicism and Buddhism, recommended by Sheila Tobin. So I'll just pop that up here. Yeah, I think that's going to be mostly a wrap for this. Would you ladies like to just add any last thoughts on the chapter before we leave it till next week for folks?
Well, quick comment. My dear husband has stepped upstairs and passed me a note, and it's very sweet and very precious. Rita, remember, philosophy is love of logic, and we instead love our Lord. So I thought that was a very sweet, touching way to wrap up.
Very nicely said. And with this conversation of the East, Paul McKay is saying greetings from Bangkok, early morning. So greetings, Paul. So it has come full circle. Susan, any final thoughts you'd like to add?
Um, just a personal observation. This being my first time um, with you and this club, I am so proud of all the uh, chat room people. I mean, you are just engaged, and what a great job you did tonight.
Amen. Well said. And yes, thank you. Thank you to Gretelin on the back end, who's been interacting with the chat on the part of the society and highlighting comments for us to try to get to. I know that we didn't get to everything that was contributed, but it is always a wonderful and vibrant chat. And you can continue the conversation. The live chat will end, but all of these episodes are archived in the playlist. If you're on the playlist, on the mailing list, you'll get the link to this episode and where you can find all of the previous meetings. There it is on the screen, so you can scan that or click the link in the chat. We'd love for you to go back and revisit if you want to, and you can chat in the comments. You can start conversations with one another with replies and continue this great conversation, because one time through this book, as we now approach the end, we're getting towards the conclusion and this summary chapter. One time through this book, I can tell you, is hardly sufficient for a lifetime. I do want to just point out our guest for next week, who will be joining us, is Gregory Pine. Those of you who have been attendees at Chesterton conferences over the last several years will possibly know Mr. Pine. He's a wonderful literature teacher. And a Chestertonian. He teaches literature in public school down in Florida, but he was also a founding member and on the board of the Chesterton Academy of Orlando, a member of the Chesterton Society of Orlando. So he'll be joining us to speak about the ultimate chapter of the book, The Five Deaths of the Faith. So we hope that you tune in next time. I'd like to thank Rita and Susan once again, our guests. It's been a pleasure having you with us today. Thank you. And to all of you in the chat, thank you so much for joining us. As always, we would love to have your support. The QR code up there in the corner. You could also, if you're interested, support us in a more substantial way by becoming a Knight of the Society of G.K. Chesterton. Those are people that commit to a monthly donation. But if you can't make it into that class of monthly gift, any monthly support that you can provide, we do services like this book club and all of the other things we try to bring you via our social media and our podcast and our email newsletters and our website, this great repository of Chesterton knowledge. It is all based on your member support. So we appreciate whatever you're able to do. And we hope that you will join us next week as we continue this discussion, which will hopefully be just as vibrant as it was this week, because as we know, Chesterton's always better with friends, right? Until next week, God bless everyone.